that to start. Okay, so that's going good. All right, and got it. Hi, everybody. Oh. Do you hear my, I've got.
Well, good evening, everyone, and happy Yom HaAtzmaut. Today is a very lovely day to celebrate the birth of the State of Israel and the culture that we have been learning about this last year. So before we begin tonight's session and introduce Dr. Korazim, I just want to offer a moment of thank you. This has been a lovely series, and tonight will be our concluding session, of course. So I'd like to thank Alana Zimmerman for all of her help and support in getting this put together, and Jacqueline Singer, our communications director, and all of our tech people for helping us do this tonight and every night for this series. And a very special thank you to Lil and Jess Beim for their constant support and love of the College of Jewish Studies. Thank you for helping us make this dream come true. Tonight, we celebrate together Yom HaAtzmaut. Actually, it's an extraordinary day if you've ever been in Israel this time of year. The day we just passed was Yom HaZikaron, Memorial Day. Very somber and difficult day in Israel because there isn't a family in Israel that hasn't been touched by the violence of its wars or the terrorist attacks. And this is the day that all of those victims and all of those who were lost are remembered. And then right away at the end of the day, a siren sounds and the entire country turns from grieving to dancing, to a celebration of the miracle of Israel's existence. It's one of the most extraordinary Jewish moments of our lives. Tonight, we're privileged to study once again with Dr. Rachel Korazim, wonderful scholar of Jewish culture, Israeli literature, and the Israeli experience. And tonight we're going to be talking about our connection to the land and the miracle of the state. Dr. Korazim, Rachel, Brucha Ba'a, welcome.
Bruchim הנמצאים. Let me greet you in a way that is appropriate for me at this time. For me, it's Boker Tov, good morning. This is 5 a.m. in the morning of Yom HaAtzmaut in Israel. But if you can see my screen, and I hope you do, you can see that I still have full electric light. My windows, let me show you, are still very dark. You can see the lower part. The sun did not yet rise in Israel, but I will, and it will. And before I say goodbye to you, I will show you my window again, and you will see that the sun is up and we are into Yom HaAtzmaut in Israel. Let me start by saying a word to both Ilana and Rabbi Feinstein at this point about the choice of the session for today. I have been teaching about Israel, Israeli society, and its culture through literature for many years. And I have, by virtue of that, a very large choice of sessions. For instance, the COVID days, where I literally moved to live on Zoom, I have developed a whole, I would say, plethora of different poetry and literature sessions about Israel. So I've added a few dozens more into that catalog. I'm not even sure, Ilana, that you have the list of all those other ones that have been developed since COVID. And then we were emailing back and forth about which session to choose for Yom HaAtzmaut for you. And then Ilana comes back to me a few days ago, and it was so charming, nice, wonderful for me to see your choice, and I will tell you why. The session that I call, and you have chosen for this day, I called it Connection to the Land, Hakesher im Haaretz. And this is the first one ever I have developed in those series. So this is what I thought some 25, 30 years ago when I started doing this. This is what I want my audiences to feel, to touch, to learn, to hear about Israeli poetry, about Israeli, the theme of connectedness to the land in Israeli poetry. Needless to say, I upgraded it since. I changed some of the poetry. I added more relevant stuff, newer stuff. I saw what was more interesting to people and less, but we are still with what I have learned to call since then the Rachel Korozim 101 session, you know, the first one of coming into this conversation. So for me, it's like Chadesh Yamenu Kakedem, go back to my earlier work, and I enjoy it. Let me put my PowerPoint on the screen, and you can see that I was ready for you this morning, this night, with the Valley Bat Shalom and the Israeli flags. But at the bottom of the slide, I wanted a graphic, I wanted a picture that will suggest the idea that you can stand at a certain point and look at Jerusalem. Like this is the southern tip of the city of Jerusalem, the promenade, the Has promenade, from which you have a beautiful look at both the old and the modern city of Jerusalem. And people stand there, you know, even during COVID days, looking at the city with their own impressions. And this is where we are going. I have a large choice of poetry. I'm not sure we shall do them all in the type that they have, but who cares? We are in no rush. We will spend as much time as we need on every poem, and then we will see where it takes us. As you are standing with me, you know, with the face to the city and your back to wherever your back is metaphorically, I would suggest that when the topic of how one connects to the land of Israel in the Jewish world comes up, there can be many answers, and nowadays, of course, many ideological answers, but for many a year, something like the following would go like, the land of Israel, what do you mean? Like, we have always been connected. This is where our culture starts. This is Abraham, God promised all that. This is our land. We all connect to it, etc. But when you look at Israeli poetry, when you look at the Jewish discourse, you will always find the, hang on for a minute, not so fast. It's not so easy to connect to that land. It can be complicated. You may dream about it, you may say stuff about it, but then when you come in touch with the real place, can be complicated. And it's the not so fast and the can be complicated that we are going to explore a little bit this evening for you, morning for myself here in Israel. And my choice, as oftentimes, to start would be Yehuda Amichai. So on the screen is a relatively, I would say, mid-career poem by Yehuda Amichai. The title is from Mitoch Shirei Eretz Zion V'Yerushalayim. You can see one of the many pictures available online of Yehuda Amichai by a window. There is a reason for that. There is a very famous Amichai poem about how some people, when you are in a room, there is always somebody standing in a window. So this is like a proverbial Amichai picture where he is the one person standing by the window. As we are going to literally explore this poem, and I'm already warning you, this is the one we'll probably spend the most time with today. I'm going to engage a little bit of your help in its reading. I like the conversation about this poem indeed to start with a conversation. So here is the screen. Look at it. It has the Ivrit, the Hebrew, on the right-hand side. It has the English Hannah Bloch of blessed memory translation from Berkeley, passed away, I'm going to say close to 10 years ago, her translation on the left-hand side. This is a translation that was created in Yehuda Amichai's lifetime, and you can see already that he passed away that many years ago, more than 20 years ago. I am saying that because we are going to relate to translation before we are done. The poetic work of the translator, in this case, a poet in her own right, merits our attention as well. So we will start with paying attention to translation, and we will add and with it. So I could see by quickly scanning the different screens as we started that there were some of the names on the screen that suggested that there are fluent Hebrew speakers in the room. And I'm going to stop my share and look at the screen. Some of you are generous enough to turn on your cameras. So I'm going to address yourself too. I'm looking to start my conversation by asking for somebody who is fluent in Hebrew, but I'm saying this tongue in cheek, but you will understand me, but not a rabbi, because I know the rabbi is fluent in Hebrew. Why am I saying somebody fluent in Hebrew, yet not a rabbi? Because I'm going to ask a question about the translation for those who are fluent in Hebrew, and I will need a one-word answer, yes or no. And rabbis have a hard time with that, because when I will ask the rabbi a question about the text and translation and interpretation, the rabbi will go, well, it depends. I don't want the "it depends" at this point. I want a straightforward answer. Do I have a Hebrew speaker in the room who is not a rabbi? Is there somebody like that? Can they unmute for a sec and tell me, yeah, I'm here, Rachel, I'll do it for you. Anybody? Hebrew speaker, not a rabbi, willing to work with me for 1 minute. Come on, Chaverim, you can do that. Orna?
Okay, Rachela, I'm here. I'll do
Daphna?
it.
Beseder. Daphna, keep still for a moment, Daphna. Keep still. I am putting the screen back on my PowerPoint presentation. You have the text on the screen. And Daphna, I'm asking you a very simple question with a very simple yes or no answer. I'm asking you to look at the title, just the title. I'm reading it for you. מתוך שירי ארץ ציון וירושלים. And then I'm reading the English from the Songs of Zion the Beautiful. Is the translation correct? Daphna.
I'm looking, I'm thinking. I feel like this is a
I
trick
don't need you to
question.
think. I need you to
Okay.
say yes or no. Is the translation correct?
מתוך שירי ארץ ציון וירושלים.
וירושלים, from the Songs of Zion the Beautiful. Is this an exact translation? Oh, Daphna,
No.
you can be a
No.
rabbi. No, toda rabba. Thank you very much. Done. It's not a correct translation. Now I need somebody else. Now I need somebody else. Listen up, Chaverim. I need you to pay attention to me. Thank you, Daphna, for your help. That was very helpful. Now I need somebody who has no Hebrew. Yet that person that I'm looking for in our audience, in our virtual class tonight, would be a person who is comfortable in shul, who comes to services, who knows their way around the siddur and does not need to leave back and forth, somebody who knows the business. I'm not checking how many times a year you show up in shul, for sure not in COVID years. But I need that person who has no Ivrit, no Hebrew, and yet is very comfortable in Valley Bet Shalom environment or other synagogues for that matter. Is there somebody like that, no Ivrit, comfortable in shul, who is willing to have a conversation with me? A very short one. It's not a test. Is there anybody? I can do without, but I would love to have a person like that. Is there anybody, no Ivrit, comfortable in shul? Mr. Stephen, are you that person for me who was raising your hand? Will you unmute yourself?
Yes.
Okay, Stephen, so great of you to agree to be that. So we agreed that you have no Ivrit. I'm fine with that. I have no problem with that. I like for you, this is what I asked for. So I'm not asking you to translate for me. I know Ivrit, you do not know Ivrit. I do not ask you to translate. I know the translation. I'm asking you for something totally, totally different. I'm asking you to listen to the words of the title in Ivrit, in Hebrew, and tell me if they ring a bell. If just the sound, no translation needed, just the sound if it rings a bell for you, is that a good deal? Can you do that for me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm reading the Ivrit for you. Don't struggle to translate, just react to the sound. Mishirei Eretz Tzion veYerushalayim. Eretz Tzion veYerushalayim. Does that ring a bell for you? Just the sound.
Just the sound. It just, yeah, it sounds like it has to do with the land.
Yeah, but you are struggling to translate. Now,
Yeah.
I'll do something, and I don't want you to translate.
Okay.
So let us go a step further, and good of you to be with me. I am a horrible singer. I cannot carry a tune if my life depended on it, but for the sake of education, I will sing. Listen up. The same words that I just said to you. Eretz Tzion veYerushalayim. I'm now singing. Eretz Tzion veYerushalayim. Does that ring a bell, Stephen?
It sounds familiar. Yeah.
It sounds familiar. Can somebody help Stephen with the sounds familiar? What does it sound like?
Hatikva.
Yeah, Sheila, go ahead.
Hatikva.
Hatikva. This is the Israeli anthem. Okay, this is Hatikva, the Israeli anthem. Thank you, Chevre, for being so cooperative and working with my crazy ideas of teaching, but I need it for that. So on one hand, somebody is telling me that the translation is not exact, is not correct. On the other hand, people are reacting to the sound of the translation and are saying, Rachel, this sounds like the Israeli anthem. At this point, I'm looking at the English translation, the amazing, not correct, Israeli English translation of Hannah Bloch, which says, from the songs of Zion the Beautiful. And you can see that this absolutely talented translator had created something for the English reader that exists in the Hebrew for the Hebrew reader. She created something that is reminiscent of an anthem like America the Beautiful. She had created a cultural adaptation from the songs of Zion the Beautiful to let the American reader think that, wow, this sounds like America the Beautiful. So we know, and if you know a little bit about Amichai, and if you do not, I will tell you more as we go today, you will know that if Amichai had decided to include in the title something reminiscent of the anthem, he's going to have an inner conversation with the national anthem. He might even mess with the national anthem, being the Amichai that he is. And this is where we are going. So let me read the Ivrit for you, then we will read the English and discuss the poem in Ivrit, in English, but it needs to be read at least once in Hebrew. ירושלים, מקום שהכל זוכרים ששכחו בו משהו, אבל הם אינם זוכרים מה שכחו. ולצורך זכירה זו אני חובש על פניי את פני אבי. זוהי עירי שבה מתמלאים כלי חלומותיי כמו מיכלי חמצן של צוללים לצלול, הקדושה בה הופכת לפעמים לאהבה, והשאלות ששואלים בהרים האלה נשארו כתמיד, ראית את הצאן שלי? ראית את הרועה שלי? ודלת ביתי פתוחה כמו קבר שמתוכו קמו לתחייה. I'm going with the English, reading it through for once, and then coming back and going slowly. Jerusalem is a place where everyone remembers he has forgotten something but doesn't remember what it is. And for the sake of remembering, I wear my father's face over mine. This is the city where my dream containers fill up like diverse oxygen tanks. Its holiness sometimes turns into love. And the questions that are asked in these hills are the same as they have always been. Have you seen my sheep? Have you seen my shepherd? And the door of my house stands open like a tomb where someone was resurrected. Okay, I don't know how many hundreds of times I have read this, and I'm still in awe at this beautiful creation. And I hope before we leave this page, some of you at least will be as well. Let us look at the opening line. ירושלים, מקום שהכל זוכרים ששכחו בו משהו, אך הם אינם זוכרים מה שכחו. Jerusalem, a place where everyone remembers that they have forgotten something, but doesn't remember what it is. That's the next line. Let us look at the opening two lines. If an Israeli Jewish poet is putting in a couple of opening lines of his poem the words Jerusalem, remembering, and forgetting, do you really need to be a biblical scholar to know that that person is making a reference to a work of poetic art created way, way, way before them? Jerusalem, remembering, forgetting. I think that most people can easily recognize the biblical allusion. If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, if I do not remember, etc., etc. This is a quote from Psalms, easily recognizable. And by the way, teachers, educators among you, always my PowerPoint presentation is available to you should you want it and use it in your teaching. Very clearly, Yehuda Amichai, in the opening lines of his poem, just like I did, copying him, going in his footsteps, I said, is it not obvious? Why are you asking stupid questions, Rachel, about the connection to the land? The same, metaphorically, Jerusalem. That is the place that we all know, that is there in our scriptures, that King David was writing about, if we do believe that he is the composer, the creator of Psalms, as we traditionally believe. That is the place. When we come to Jerusalem, we all, many of us, may have the sense of, yeah, I know this place. I might have forgotten something here, just like the biblical poet. But then comes the next line, but doesn't remember what it is. And I'd like you to take you back, those of you who have experienced that, and the others, just believe me, you know, when you have that experience, Ilana, I'll be talking to you. You may come with me on this one. When we take a group of teenagers to Jerusalem, and we have done all the proper preparation, of course, in school or in shul, and we had all those sessions before, and especially we talked to them about Yerushalayim, and we talked to them about the wall, and when you'll come to the Western Wall, you will see the vibrations and the connectedness and all that. And then we get them off the bus and we take them to the wall, and most kids are fine. And they are indeed excited, and they touch the wall, and they call their mom, and whatever needs to be done when you're excited. But there is always, always that one kid who you can look, that blank face, and they go, it's a wall, you know? It's a wall. It's not connecting. And we have done all we could. We want them to know that there is something for them in Jerusalem, but they cannot remember what it is. It's not happening. And my question to the contemporary reader and the reader in faraway Los Angeles is, who is Amichai talking about? Who are those people who, when they come to Jerusalem, have this sense that I know I ought to feel something, but what can I tell you? It's not happening. And oftentimes where I used to teach this in front of live audience, and I believe the virtual ones are the very same, somebody will raise their hand and say, especially if I do that in Yerushalayim, this is about us, diaspora Jews. Amichai is your classical Israeli, always criticizing diaspora Jews, and he thinks that we are not connected enough or something like that. Let me tell you, it's not true. And I don't think that this is the addressee in Amichai's opening lines. I don't think that he's speaking about diaspora Jews. The funniest experience that ever happened to me teaching those lines was to an audience of, how shall I say this without pointing fingers, Orthodox male audience, okay? So you can imagine what the class looks like. I am the only woman and they are all Orthodox guys. I cannot remember the reason why at all they invited me to teach them, but it happened. And it's in Yerushalayim, in Kiryat Moriah, I think. And I start reading. I said, no, guys, who is addressed in this poem? Who is the poet talking about? Who is the person who cannot connect? And like a choir, they tell me Tel Avivim, people from Tel Aviv. And I cracked up laughing because I, of course, am a Tel Aviv. I schlepped to Jerusalem that day to teach them. I live in Jaffa, in the southern part of Tel Aviv. Said, so Avichai is talking about me. Thank you so much. And then they went, no, slicha, mechila, etc., etc. I said, don't worry, I'm not taking any offense. It's fine. But I'd like to suggest that this is not who Amichai is addressing. Neither diaspora Jews, nor Tel Avivim or Tel Aviviyot in my case. Amichai is doing something very different. Hold my hand, follow me to the next line. And for the sake of remembering, I wear my father's face over mine. Hey, look at that fifth line. I, my father's. Amichai is talking about himself. He, the poet, who comes from an Orthodox education. He left the Orthodox way of life later in life, who knows scriptures, who can playfully play with both the anthem and psalms easily in his poems, totally at home in the Jewish world, totally knowing, lives smack in the middle of Yerushalayim. Like, you know, Mishkanot Sha'ananim on the verge of overlooking the city, the old city. Avichai is talking about himself. He says, there is something in me that needs to remember something that I do not remember. And for the sake of remembering, I wear my father's face over mine. Now, Avichai's father was a diaspora Jew from Germany. Avichai is now for many years an Israeli, fought in all the wars, defended the city, teaches in Yerushalayim, publishes poetry. And yet he says, in order to better understand this place and how I connect to it, I need my father's face. I need to look through his eyes. I need to smell through his nose. I need to feel the city on my skin as if it was his. So obviously my father, quote unquote, in Amichai, had a better understanding than the person who lives in Yerushalayim. Amichai, in order to better connect, needs that extra knowledge, that extra understanding that does not come from running back and fro within Jerusalem, from paying your taxes and picking up your kids in kindergarten. No, something different that comes from afar, the longing, maybe. So this is what the poet is seeking, to get an understanding and a feel for the city and its remembrance, and the city, in this case, metaphorical, probably for the rest of Zion, through layers and layers of longing of people who never lived there. But in order to do that, and since this is a poem and we are not only interested in statements, but in the art of poetry, I am going to draw your attention to one word now. I wear my father's face over mine, and the Hebrew is Ani chovesh al panai et pnei avi. And we are going to talk about this time not only the beauty and the art of translation that I have pointed out to you at the beginning, but sometimes the shortcoming of translations. So I am going to step out for a minute from my PowerPoint and address you so that I can see you for a couple of moments in order to discuss this. English, the blessed language. It's not my mother tongue. Yet I think that by now you may agree that I have a decent knowledge of the language, right? With mistakes here and there, with Israeli accent, I'll grant you all that, but still. In English, if I remember correctly, you wear everything that you put on your body. You wear your slacks, your shoes, your hats, your perfume, your jewelry, everything that you put on your body, you wear. Is that not correct? Thank you. But in Ivrit, bless the language. May I address you personally, Rabbi, now for a minute? Add my friend. You gorev your socks, noel your shoes, lovesh your slacks, chovesh your hat, ode your jewelry, markiv your glasses, ote your mask for COVID, and I could go on and on and on. The Hebrew language has a specific verb for every single item that you put on your body. That's the weirdness, the interest of the language. And here is Hannah Bloch in Berkeley, California. That many years ago, I'm thinking the 80s probably when this was translated. And Yehuda Amichai is putting something on his body, another face, not a mask, another face. I wear my father's face over mine. And she has all those verbs to choose from. But there is no verb for putting faces on your body because normal people, except for Amichai, don't put other people's face on their face. So she's looking at the plethora of options and she's choosing the chovesh one. That is the one that you use in order to put something on your head, to cover your head. You chovesh your kippah. You chovesh your hat. But this is Hebrew, and I'm inviting you into a serious language class. Israeli words, Hebrew words, depend on their roots. And roots in most cases are of 3 letters. So in the case of chovesh, you don't need to speak Hebrew for that. Just go with me. Are the letters chet bet shin. And if you look into the root, it will tell you secrets. Because chet bet shin, indeed, chovesh, cover your head. So Amichai may suggest, you want to better understand the city? Will you cover your head, man, and look like a Jew finally? So that you can better get it like my dad did? Maybe. But the root, chet bet shin, entails other things. Those of you who traveled in Israel at the time when you still needed a paramedic on the bus, anybody can remember that? The name, the word for a paramedic is chovesh, the very same one. So the root entails the notion of healing, of setting right, of dressing a wound. Not enough. Those of you who have knowledge of Hebrew poetry from the beginning of the 20th century for over 100 years ago may remember a quote by Chaim Nachman Bialik, chovesh et safsalei beit hamidrash, dresses the benches of yeshiva, about that guy who constantly studies. So the verb chovesh also entails studying, learning. And those of you who read Tanakh in the original know about Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah in English, chavush bevet ha'asurim, committed to prison. So of all the possible verbs to choose for, Amichai, for that particular action of trying to properly understand connectedness to the city, he chooses the verb chovesh, carrying with him all those extra meanings in order to better understand the city. Letzorech zechira zot, for the sake of understanding, I need to wear to chovesh my father's face over mine. I need to go through all this process of remembering. It's not just, remind me quickly. No, there is a process here, zechira. And I want to bring with me all those additional meanings. I need to do something that is about being Jewish. I need to do something that is about healing. I need to do something that is about studying. I need to do something that is about commitment. not easy, the connectedness to the land. But it's magical, because as soon as you have done the right thing, and of course the English cannot carry all those additional meanings, but as soon as you have done that, just covered your father's face over yours, I'd like to suggest a reading that will go for just the English reader. A very simple reading. And I want to speak to those of you who are not old, but old enough for the following. That moment, for the first time, when you inadvertently went by a mirror, or just a glass, or just a window, and looked for a bit, and lo and behold, it was your father looking at you, or your mother. For the first time that you realized after so many years that you didn't want to be like your father or your mom, that indeed you looked like them. And the first time it's very annoying. But as years go by and with them, your parents, it's not so bad anymore to wake up in the morning and see your mom in the mirror in your bathroom every morning. Not so terrible. Could Amichai just be suggestions, Chevre? In order to better get this place, let me tell you what we need to do. You need to mature. You need to think like your father. Don't rush with those hasty feelings and thinking. Just listen to your father, think a bit, feel like him, see like me, etc. Because if you do, the magic will happen. It will. And you will understand this is the city where my dream containers fill up like diverse oxygen tanks. This is what the city means for you. This is what the land of Israel could mean for you. A source of filling your soul, your dream containers, which is metaphorical. None of us has a dream container in their body as an organ. It's just a metaphor, but how beautiful. And you fill it up like a scuba diver is carrying those tanks with them underwater. All scuba divers in the room, and I'm not going to check how many you have, but trust me, you have one because I'm a scuba diver, will know that Amichai was not a scuba diver. Because when you scuba dive, you do not carry oxygen in your tanks. That would kill you. Oxygen is what they give you from the tanks in hospital when you are sick and you need a little bit extra. When you scuba dive, you take compressed air. Amichai did not know that, but it doesn't matter because he knew poetry. And I want you to listen to what he does with the sound of oxygen and the rest, the coming lines. So I'm reading the Ivrit and then the English. זוהי עירי שבה מתמלאים כלי חלומותיי, כמו מיכלי חמצן של צוללים לצלול. This is the city where my dream containers fill up like diverse oxygen tanks, but the Hebrew goes חמצן, oxygen, צוללים לצלול. He wanted the צללה sound that comes from חמצן, oxygen, that suggests the sound and the depth to dive, but also the see-through, the clarity of the city. You can get the depth, you can get the clarity, you can hear the sound with those words. Bingo, we reached the middle of the poem, and this is important. And now I'm taking those 30 seconds of really being literature teachery for a moment and inviting all literature teachers who they are there or students of literature to remind themselves and count very quickly that this poem has 14 lines. And by virtue of that, it is a sonnet, and sonnets have their rules. And in sonnets, when you reach the middle, a switch will happen. There'll be a turn, there'll be a shift, and Amichai knows that. So we have reached that point, and we have reached those very important few lines that are the beginning. This is the sound of the oxygen and clarity. And now we come to holiness. Its holiness sometimes turns into love. In the middle of the poem, after the wow effect, Amichai stops for a minute, steps aside, and looks, its holiness sometimes turns into love. By virtue of that, he has told us two things. A, that he knows it's holy and recognizes it, but also he's adding the word love, and he is adding the word sometimes. And this is what I need to talk about. Because if its holiness turns into love sometimes, there are all those other times when it does not. When it can turn into hatred, indifference, anger, many things. And we are looking at one of the earliest Amichai poems who taught us this multiple way of being connected. You can recognize the holiness. You can recognize how important the city is, and yet at the same time, reserve your opinion sometimes and say, yeah, I know it's holy. You don't need to preach at me. But that thing that happened the other day at the border in the eastern part of the city, where I saw that policeman doing this, that, or the other, that I do not like. That does not turn into love. You can recognize, you can be committed, you can love, and yet at the same time, sometimes reserve your voice and say, this one, I do not love. You can then continue to the questions that are asked in these hills, time from times immemorial. Have you seen my sheep? Have you seen my shepherd? And you know that these are not questions about Baba, real sheep, although they could be. They are questions about leadership and following leadership. They are questions about spiritual, divine leadership, and whether you still have that eye on you, whether you still keep your eye looking there. Do you still see your shepherd? I want to conclude by paying attention to another translation issue in the last couple of lines that are always enigmatic. And the door of my house stands open like a tomb where someone was resurrected in English. And in Hebrew, ודלת ביתי פתוחה כמו קבר שמתוכו קמו לתחייה. Honest to God, I don't know why a person wants to equate their home to a tomb. But maybe the idea that your home in Jerusalem is like an open tomb suggests already the upcoming of the end of days, of salvation, of Geula. But here is an interesting phenomenon that you may want to look at, and it's important. The Hebrew says kamu, which is plural, who have resurrected. The English says someone. The notion of kamu, plural, the many have risen to life, is a Jewish one. When Messiah comes, when Geula, salvation comes, then we shall all rise from the dead. There's someone resurrected, not so Jewish. Did Amichai, together with Hannah Bloch, agree for the English translation to be more universal, more open to other readings? I do not know, but the option is there. So let me, as I told you, I have spent a long time with this one for a reason, and I want to check, and I will allow one or two comments if there are any. You can raise your hand if you wanted to. I don't see any, so this is my cue to continue to yet another poem. So let me address two poems sort of together, and I'm taking you to a very different time. If this poem comes to us from the 80s of the 20th century, the earlier one, this one, we are looking at the poet Rachel, thinking about the shores of the Kinneret. So an immigrant of the second wave of Zionist immigration to the land of Israel. She came in the year, I think, 1910 to Israel, which is the midst of what we call the second Aliyah. She had tuberculosis and died at a very young age, but left behind her an amazing collection of poetry, some of which was set to music, especially this one that we are looking at. It was set to music still in her lifetime. She died in 1931 at the age of 40. And it is the kind of poetry that will appear in school readers. But I'm going to look at Rachel and her poetry through two poems and suggest that the same poet could have two different approaches. So let us look at this one, a very famous one, and I'm sure the Israelis in the room can, in their heart, hum the tune, Lo Sharti Lach Artzi, in the beautiful Chava Alberstein rendition that we are not doing today. לא שרתי לך ארצי ולא פארתי שמך. I have not sung you, my country, not brought glory to your name with the great deeds of a hero or the spoils of battle yields. But on the shores of the Jordan, my hands have planted a tree, and my feet had made a pathway through your fields. Modest are the gifts I bring you. I know this, mother. Modest, I know the offerings of your daughter, only an outburst of a song on a day when the light flares up, only a silent tear for your poverty. So this is it, you know. This is the kind of poem, the kind of song, and in Hebrew there is no difference between the two. They are both shir, that we would be raised upon both in Israel and probably outside of Israel as well in Zionist circles. Rachel is totally committed. And no matter how much she has given the country, it is never enough from her perspective. It is so modest. And look at the language that is used here. Give me just a moment here because I want to show you something. And I need for my PowerPoint to work. So I want you to see all the words that suggest that it's modest, it's not enough, it's but, all those semi-negative, hesitant language, only, modest, nothing but, thinking of yourself as so small, yet so committed, yet wanting to do so much and never finding everything you do enough for your commitment to the land. When I discuss and teach this poem, as I have done, I trust at Valley Bet Shalom with Rabbi Nina, was to suggest the feminine voice of that time. We are not going there today because I want to show you something else in that topic of connections to the land. So we are staying with Rachel, and this time I'm going a little bit slower. The same poet, discrepancy in time between the two poems, less than a year. הו ארצי, הורתי, מדוע כה שדוף נופך ועצב, זיכרונה של ארץ חורגת, בלי משים עולה על הלב. על גבעה פרחחי אשוח, במישור ישישי אלון, במורד על חופי הפלג, בנות לבנה בכסות שבתון. יד השמש תקצר מתקוע, בלב היער רומח אדום, יום תמים במשכן בני אורן, אפלה ריחנית וחלום. הוי אמי, הנחלה עלייך, הנטבע עלבונך מאל, על מוקי צהרייך כקודם, עוד תרעיפי ניחוח וצל. And I read this fully in Hebrew, mainly, not only, but mainly for the sake of the Hebrew speakers who were raised maybe in Israel on Rachel poetry. And I wanted, and I hope I was successful, to give them that moment of, what is this? I've never seen this poem kind of thing. And I thought I knew Rachel. This is the reaction I want, because this poem very few people saw. So let us go through the English and try and figure out why. While the first one was called To My Land, this one is called Oh My Land. And by the time we are done, maybe some of you will think about it as Oy vey, my land. Okay, so it's the very same Rachel. And the picture I gave you is the picture of how bleak and dry and no trees was the land of Israel in the 20s when Rachel is writing those, the 20s, not of the 21st of our times, the 20s of the 20th century, before the state. Oh, my land, my parent, why is so landscape so blighted and gloomy? The memory of a stepmother land imperceptibly creeps into the heart. Upon the hillside, the sprightly fir tree, on the plain, the ancient oak, on the slopes, on the shores of the stream, the birch maidens in their Shabbat garb. The arm of the sun is too short to cast its fiery lens into the heart of the forest. A whole day in the abode of the pines, scented darkness and a dream. Oh, my mother, surely we yearn for you. Surely we will claim your abuse from God, and as in former times, you will again spread fragrance and shade over those stricken by your noontime heat. Rachel, the one who is 2 minutes ago in that poem was so, wow, I'm not doing enough, is now sitting probably somewhere on these hills, looking at the land. Oh, my land, my parents. Yeah, she calls it Ima, Horati, my parent. But she's complaining, she's scratching. Why is your landscape so blighted and gloomy? Mom, I love you, but my goodness, are you ugly? The memory of a stepmother land imperceptibly creeps into the heart. Oy vey, is that all kosher? For a pioneer of the second Aliyah, you know, the times of your Ben-Gurions and Goldas and such, to complain, to think of a stepmother land, Poltava, now in the Ukraine, as an option of a mother? Oy, it's like really breaking the commandments of the second Aliyah of pioneering. You are not supposed to miss home. And Rachel, our totally Zionist poet, third graders are singing her songs and poems. Let me tell you, she wasn't happy all the time. Why? Now the memory that crept into the heart. She didn't want to, imperceptibly, but it did. And she remembers upon the hillside the sprightly fir tree, on the plain the ancient oak, on the slopes, on the shores of the stream, the birch maidens on their Shabbat garb. Fir tree, oak, birch. She is missing trees. You can understand that. And I gave you the graphics to help your understanding. They had no trees, they had no shade. It was terrible. But look at it, something very subtle. The wave of immigration that we call the second Aliyah, 1904 to 1914, among which Rachel came, was by and large, not only, but by and large, a one-generational wave of immigrants. These were young people, mainly men, who, not families like in the first Aliyah or later, fourth Aliyah and so on, who left home, left shtetl and town and cheder and family on their own and came to the land. And upon everything else, the difficulty, the heat, the lack of shade, the lack of trees, the lack of work, they also missed family. And you can see how she is not really hiding, but including it in her memory of the trees, because the fir trees are sprightly, pirchachei, like young people, maybe her teen brothers. An ancient oak, yeshishei alon, grandpa, and the birch maidens in white, sisters, friends, whom she had left behind. So the second verse of this poem includes the reason for the longing. It's the trees, it's the family, it's the multi-generational community. But once I've started speaking to you about trees, let me tell you about trees, because you Israelis, kids in Israel, you don't understand what I mean when I miss those trees. And the shade, my goodness, how she missed the shade. The arm of the sun is too short to cast the fiery lens into the heart of the forest. You know how thick and dense the forest was in my country, Ukraine? That even in the middle of the day, the sun could not penetrate through the trees. The arm of the sun is too short to cast its fiery lens into the heart of the forest. The sun did not come through. A whole day in the abode of the pines, scented darkness and a dream. Oi, how she is missing home. But then the true Zionist soul comes into play, and immediately she doesn't let her horses run away. She holds back. Sorry, Mom, sorry. Oh, my mother, I'm sorry. Please excuse me. I didn't mean to hurt you. Surely we yearn for you. Surely we will claim your abuse from God. And as in former times, you will again spread fragrance and shade over those stricken by your noontime heat. If all the endeavors of the pioneers were successful, if all their prayers were to be heard, God willing, in this Rachel's poem from 1921, it's now over 100 years old, Israel will look like what if everything works? Like the Ukraine? Is that what they want? Israel will look like home, like we remember. I don't know that this is what really happened, but for sure we have a little bit more shade than we did at the time. So a word about these two poems coming to us from about 100 years ago. They are barely a year apart. The two about how the very same committed person could have their times of homesickness. Those pioneers, yes, they were committed, yes, they were connected, and yet at the same time, they missed home. I'm just checking to see if there is a hand raised, and if not, am I good to do one more poem, Ilana? How am I doing with time? Still good? You will yell at me, okay, when you want me to get ready to stop, because I can, once I'm up, I can go. And so let us go to one of my utmost favorites in this conversation. Not that I don't want, that I don't love Amichai and Rachel. You can see that I do. But we are coming to Leah Goldberg, and this is important. So we are looking at a poem that is in circles of readers of Hebrew poetry and also in translation, pretty well known. It was set to music by Achinoam Nini, who you guys are calling Noah. So you can see that in spite of the fact that Leah Goldberg died in the year 1970, so over 50 years ago, it is still even contemporary poets and singers and musicians, this sings to them. So let us read quickly the Ivrit and then come to those lines that I want to highlight. Oren. כאן לא אשמע את כל הקוקייה, כאן לא יחבוש העץ מצנפת שלג, אבל בצל האורנים האלה כל ילדותי שקמה לתחייה. צלצול המחטים היה אקרא מולדת למרחב השלג, לקרח ירקרק כובל הפלג, ללשון השיר בארץ נוכריה. אולי רק ציפורי מסע יודעות כשהן תלויות בין ארץ ושמיים, את זה הכאב של שתי המולדות. איתכם אני נשתלתי פעמיים, איתכם אני צמחתי אורנים, ושורשיי בשני נופים שונים. Trees, pine tree. Here I will not hear the voice of the cuckoo. Here the tree will not wear a cape of snow, but it is here in the shade of these pines my whole childhood reawakens, the chime of the needles once upon a time. I call the snow space homeland, and the green ice at the river's edge was the poem's grammar in a foreign place. Perhaps only migrating birds know suspended between earth and sky, the heartache of two homelands. With you, I was transplanted twice. With you, pine trees, I grew roots in two disparate landscapes. One could think, I think the difference of publication between these poems must be a good 40 years. That Leah Goldberg is having a conversation with Rachel and telling her, yeah, I know, Rachel, that here it's not the same. You cannot hear the voice of the cuckoo. There is no snow cape over the trees, but, and it's the but that Rachel did not have in 1921, and Leah Goldberg in the 50s or 60s does have. But there are pine trees already. And under them, there is a sense of your childhood reawakening. I can connect. And the chime of the needles, yeah, the one from back home, once upon a time, I call the snow space homeland. You know, she's not using the term stepmotherland. She's more confident. She's not afraid to tell her readership in the 50s or 60s, yeah, I call that country homeland. So what? It was my homeland. And I could write in Russian, and she did as a young person. And that language was the poem's grammar in a foreign place. And now she comes to these lines that make this poem so famous. The image, the metaphor of the migrating birds who have two homelands and constantly are between the two. Perhaps only migrating birds know, suspended between earth and sky, the heartache of two homelands. Leah Goldberg is bringing into the Hebrew Israeli poetic discourse a line that you cannot imagine how often it is quoted, the heartache of the two homelands. It's there. And it speaks to so many people to this very day. And then she concludes, if she started here, 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 I do not, she is now looking back at the pine trees and giving the motto, the credo, with you, pine trees, I was transplanted twice. With you, pine trees, I grew roots in two disparate landscapes. So here is, if you wish, the motto of a huge chunk of Israeli poetry. It's the poetry of immigrants. It's the poetry of people who needed to develop a language of connectedness, to find their own place. So before I take leave of you, I want to take a few more minutes to a much later voice and a different one. It comes to us from the poet Balfour Chakak, and it comes to us, they are two twin brother poets. This is the picture of their grandfather. You will understand in a minute why I include it. And here is the Ivrit of the poem Galut by Balfour Chakak. Balfour and Herzl Chakak were born in Baghdad in the year 1946 to a very Zionist family. Why else would their father call one of his two healthy twin boys Balfour and the other Herzl, none of which is a very classical Iraqi Jewish name because of Zionism. They make Aliyah in the early 50s, and the Aliyah, the immigration of people in those years was not an easy thing. And the welcoming committee of mainly Ashkenazi Jews in Israel at the time also left a lot to be desired. The poem was not written when they arrived. The poem was written many years later when they find their poetic voice. And let us hear it, and that would be probably our concluding poem for today. Galut, exile. Savi היו לו בגדי כהונה שקופים, ורקמה לו אמו בדש הכותונת התכולה פסי זהב יפים, וחקקה לו את שמו בעונג באותיות של כסף אור מזוקק, סבא שלי, מורד בן רפאל חקק. ועלה סבי כאברהם מאור, מאותה ארץ אל פי אותו הדיבור, הלא עלה אל אותה אדמת מולדת, ולא הייתה לו עוד הכותונת הנחמדת. ואבדה לו שררתו, ואבל נוגה פניו, נשחט הכסף, ונשחט הזהב. ובשוקים רחל סבי מכר את אוצרותיו, בגדים בלים, מרכולת אכזב, לשונו כבדה נביא נעזב. סבא שלי מלך עצוב, נולד בבגדי משי ורקמה, בגדי חמודות, וכאשר גלה אל ארץ, נשחטו בגדיו, נשחט הודו, רק במותו הלבישוהו תכריך כעטרת, טלית שקיבל מאביו, טלית ירושה, חקוקת תכלת אותיות של קדושה. ולאורך הטלית דימיתי לראות פסי זהב יפים, אור מזוקק, סבא שלי, מורד בן רפאל חקק. My grandfather's priestly garments were transparent. It's an overlayer over a colorful garment. He was decent, don't worry. His mother embroidered the hem of his blue robe with beautiful gold bands. She took pleasure etching his name in letters of silver, pure light. My grandfather, Murad ben Rafael Hakak. Like Abraham from Ur, my grandfather came up, made Aliyah. From that same land in the same manner, he came to the same homeland. No longer did he have the gorgeous robe. His supremacy was gone. His face shone with grief. The silver was tarnished and the gold butchered. My grandfather was a peddler in the market, selling his treasures, tattered clothing, second-rate merchandise, slow of speech, a forsaken prophet. My grandfather was a sorrowful king. He was born to silken garments, rich embroidery, and fine raiment. But when he was exiled to the land, his clothes were spoiled and his splendor ruined. When he died, they draped him in a shroud like a splendid robe. The talit he received from his father, his inheritance, was etched with the blue letters of holiness. Along the whole length of the talit, I thought I could see beautiful bands of gold, pure light. Saba sheli, my grandfather, Murad ben Rafael Hakak. So this is a retrospective look, glare at the experience of immigration. It starts with a beautiful description of the grandfather before he makes Aliyah, and even a generation before him, the great-grandmother that he probably didn't know, who did the beautiful embroidery, beautiful gold bands. She took pleasure etching his name in letters of silver, pure light. My grandfather, Murad ben Rafael Hakak. I cannot but think how this line is sort of an inner conversation between the poet and his own father, not grandfather. Grandpa had a real nice Iraqi name, Murad, son of Rafael Hakak. No Balfour for him, thank you very much, Dad. You know, we had our names. We didn't need to take those other names. Like my grandfather, Murad ben Rafael Hakak, like Abraham from Ur, my grandfather came up, made Aliyah from the same land in the same manner. Hello? We in Iraq did not wait for Alt-Neuland by Herzl or for the Balfour Declaration to become Zionist. Thank you very much. Our Zionists come from a book slightly earlier, you know, the one with the Lech Lecha line from it. And we came in response to that call, not to the Balfour Declaration. And he came to the land, and what happened? No longer did he have his gorgeous robe. Probably was made fun of upon Aliyah about those, you know, pioneering Israelis dressed in khaki shorts, etc. And the gorgeous robe and his supremacy was gone. His face shone with grief. and the silver was tarnished and the gold butchered. Look at the Hebrew that says Nishchat with a taf and Nishchat with a tet. My grandfather was a peddler in the market. This is what he was: tattered clothing, second-rate merchandise, slow of speech, a line that always stops me thinking. He probably had fluent Hebrew for reading Torah. He probably knew that. But would the Jewish agency bureaucrat have the patience to listen to his very unique Iraqi accent of speaking the Hebrew? I don't think so. So he becomes slow of speech, loses confidence, a forsaken prophet. He was a sorrowful king. Saul, Chizkiyahu, was born to silken garments, but when he was exiled to the land, oy vey, where is homeland? Iraq. What is exile? The land of Israel. For a whole generation, says Balfour Chakak Furat, the generation of our grandparents who came with us, maybe even their parents, the connection to the land did not happen in their lifetime, only at death. When they are put to rest in the land, you can see on the talit in which they are buried those letters of pure light, Murad ben Rafael Chakak. So let me stop at this moment. I think it's a good time for me to stop and go into the phase of conversation, if you will, and I'm looking at you, Rabbi, to lead us into it.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Those are remarkable. So let's go back for just a moment. If you could review with us the image of the bird and the image of the tree as a
The image of the bird, which bird would that be?
well, you have a couple of them, right? You have the image of in the Leah Goldberg poem, the bird, right? And,
Oh, yes. Okay.
and that's an important image because there's a Bialik poem, right? Isn't there a very
Oh,
famous
yeah.
Bialik poem about a bird? And is this
Thank
also a
you.
response to that bird?
I think so. I
That's
think
important.
so.
That's important, yeah.
And of course. And again, of course, and maybe if you had shared this possible question with me, I would have brought on the screen the other poem. So thank you for taking us there. Yes, indeed. Leah Goldberg, whom Professor Ariel Hirschfeld of Hebrew University, in one of his many talks about her poetry, calls an empire of literature, imperia shel sifrut in Hebrew, is indeed in this poem and many other, shows the readership how we actually are having conversations within Jewish texts. So the biblical is always there. And for people like Leah Goldberg, not necessarily so much the Talmudic, the Gemara discourse, prayer discourse, yes, will appear in Leah Goldberg poetry. And she is totally fluent in the poetry, the Zionist poetry, the Hebrew poetry that perceives the time. And Bialik is the one in that poem that I oftentimes call possibly the earliest Zionist poem. So the year is 1870 something when El Hatzipor is created, to the bird. Shalom Rav Shuvech Tzipora Nechmedet me'artzot hachom el chaloni. Welcome, lovely bird, from the land of warmth to my window. And when you read that poem, Rabbi, and you look at the date at the bottom, what Bialik had written is Nisan, Taf Reish Ayin something. And when he says Nisan, Nisan means Passover. Nisan means spring. And this is when the migrating birds who had wintered in Eretz Israel possibly are coming to the Ukraine, because Bialik is also from the Ukraine, like Rachel, okay? All of these people come to us from the cities that are now under fire. And Bialik does not yet at this point in his first published poem, because this is his first published poem, does not see himself as a migrating bird himself. He is not thinking Aliyah yet. So he's just having a conversation with the migrating bird. Leah Goldberg moved a step further. She became that. She moved to the land of warmth. The trees, this is amazing because she is choosing from all the Israeli trees, where Rachel was speaking about the trees she remembers from back home. Leah Goldberg is choosing for her metaphor the tree that is both here and there. Because pine trees are available back in Lithuania, in her hometown, pine trees do exist in Israel, and she is working her way between these two metaphors. And thank you for the question.
Sure. Daphne, you have a question? If you see your hand is up.
Yeah, for a while, and so does Zina. Yeah.
All right, we'll start with Daphne.
I just wanted to thank you for the Leah Goldberg poem, and I strongly urge everyone to listen to the Achinam Nini Noah, the singer Noah's rendition of it is so beautiful. And I don't remember what I was going to ask. Just I guess if I already have the stage, just to thank you for bringing it. I had forgotten about that that poem long ago. So thank you so much. It's so beautiful.
So let me ask a question about that, because this is interesting. So in America, we always cry about the fact that our kids don't know the classics. That the great, a generation ago, people knew Shakespeare by heart, and people knew great literature by heart. And our kids know computers, but they don't know literature. Do Israeli young people know this poetry, or has this been left behind in the process of history?
Well, first of all, we like to kvetch as much as you do, and every generation is unhappy with the younger generation. And of course, they don't know the classics enough, and we would have loved them to be more like ourselves, and they will be doing the same about their own children. And that's fine as that goes. However, there is this additional phenomenon, and I was having this conversation in my time last night in another class. I was teaching a less well-known Israeli poet, Avraham Khalfi. And I was teaching him to a class, and people asked me, so, do people in Israel know this poetry, and younger people? And I said, well, in the case of Avraham Khalfi, the answer is a resonant yes, but why? Avram Khalfi is known in Israel because Arik Einstein is singing his poetry. And this is the magic that we have in Hebrew and in Israel, that a lot of our classic poetry was set to music. And okay, were they also writing in Yiddish and Russian, etc.? I'll come to that in a moment. Many of these poems, not all, are sung. And once they are sung by popular singers and, classics, if you wish, like Arik Einstein, then they would be known. But it happened to me, Daphne, in American circles, when I taught Pine Tree by Leah Goldberg, somebody told me, well, I thought it was by Achinoam Nini. And that happens a lot, that people will attribute the poem to the singer, to the musician, but it helps now, as per biblical associations where our kids still study Tanakh, not only in religious schools, in secular schools, we all study Tanakh, much less than in my time, so gives me reason enough to complain, but still Tanakh lore, not necessarily the layers of responsa and explanations, etc., but the story level is well known. So we do share these sources of going back and forth between the different sources. Bialik wrote both in Yiddish and in Hebrew. Chernyakhovsky wrote in Russian and in Hebrew. Leah Goldberg left Russian behind and continue as a choice to write mainly in Hebrew, but she translated from many other languages. So many of them were polyglot. They had more than one language, and they were in between those languages offering translations into Hebrew, which was an important work as well.
Thank you. Zina, do you have a question? You have to unmute, please.
Yes, I know. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much. I feel like you were a bird taking us in a migration in the past and then in the future into the writer's brains and to Israel. And there's a very famous quote, which I forgot, but it's about wanting your children to, you give them the gift of wings and roots, you know.
Mhm.
But I wanted especially to thank you because when you showed Rachel, is it Rachel Bracha, her poetry? Yes. Well, tonight is my father's yurt site, or it just ended with the sundown. And I took my father to Israel when he was in his 90s. And I knew that he couldn't remember. You know, he wouldn't remember after he had come home, but he was still very present all the time that we were in Israel. And we visited Rachel's grave, Rachel's grave, and you showed her grave in the picture. And next to it, if you ever go there to the Kinneret, anybody, to go visit her grave, because next to it in a chain or something, you pull it up and there's her poetry in the ground, you know, in the land. And it was,
Yeah, actually, it's a stone box.
yes,
Uh,
yeah,
Here it is. It's a stone box in black next to
Yeah.
her grave, and inside there is a book of her poetry. And I have been known more than once to take groups there and teach her poetry by her grave, by Rachel's poetry. We do that. We do that. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for reminding people of that. I appreciate that. Toda rabba.
That's one of the really magical places in Israel, because it's a very quiet spot right at the tip of the Kinneret, and it's a whole hall of fame of the people who are buried there. Rachel is buried there, and Nomi Shemer is buried there, and Moshe Hess is buried there. Great socialist writer is buried there, and Ber Borachov, who was my father's hero, was buried there. So I have a family connection to this very special place. Rachel, one last question, and then we'll conclude, because I know I can see the sun is rising in your window, so it's time for breakfast. So we're here and you're there, and this has been a very difficult year on so many levels for so many people, with COVID and with the political upheavals going on. So as Yom Ha'atzmaut begins in Israel, tell us what the mood is in the country. How are people feeling? How does it feel on the street? What do you hear? What do you read in the newspaper this morning? And how are you feeling about this morning?
Well, you know, my feelings have a lot to do with age, with some experience, with choices that I have made in my life. Israeli society is very divided nowadays, and I think you share the same experience in America. It's not just polarized between one and the other option. There are many, many splits. Yet we are sort of somehow muddling through. We have a government that many oppose, yet it's working. The country is functioning. It is working. We had a beautiful opening ceremony yesterday. We have complaints, it's not perfect, but we are welcoming refugees and immigrants from the Ukraine. The security is handling most of what needs to be handled. It's not a perfect society. There is a lot that needs to be addressed, but it's functioning, it's working. Life is not bad in Israel. Life is even good in Israel. But the other aspect, it's not but, and the other aspect of it, that I, for the last almost 13 years now, have chosen to live in Yafo, which is a mixed population of Jews and Arabs. And it was a conscious choice by Yossi and I to devote a lot or much of the time that we have and energies to that Jewish-Palestinian discourse within Israel. What sometimes people like to call Arab Israelis, they don't like that term that much. And so we learn to have the conversation with our neighbors and friends here, even across difficulties, even across riots, even at days such as Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom HaZikaron, which happens to be Eid al-Fitr for the Muslim community. And what can I tell you? On Eid al-Fitr, you do fireworks and you do celebrations, etc. And it's Yom HaZikaron in Israel, and God forbid they should do it. Everybody will be mad at them because how can they not respect our day of mourning? And they will ask, and how can you not respect the fact that this is the greatest celebration of the year for us? So Yossi, I have chosen and accepted and agreed to live in Yafo so that we can be within this conversation, because we believe that before huge issues of when peace and this and that will be resolved, it's on the ground. It's the one-to-one relationship, it's the ability to listen, it's the ability to know that the other has pain, that the other has a narrative, that the other has a story. So this is my Israel ad these days. And if you, or when, not if, when you bring the people of your congregation to Israel, I would love to share some of these experiences and have you meet some of my Yafo friends and neighbors so we can continue this conversation together. I would like to add, however, with your permission, is that I continue to teach Israeli poetry online in English twice a week and once a week in Ivrit. And all you need to know is my email address. And my email address is very simple. Not only does Ilana and the rabbi have it, but you have it as you see it on the screen right now, because you see my name. Forget the Rachel, pick just the Korazim, my last name, korazim@gmail.com. This is all it takes. This is my email address. And if you email me and ask me to put you on my mailing list, it will be done after I have had breakfast, and you will get your invitations to my classes, which happens twice a week in English, Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11 p.m. West Coast time. And there are other options, but you will see them in my emails. Just let me know that you are interested, and there is no charge. You will see that in my emails, all the information. I'd love to have you in my classes. I'd love even better when next you come to Israel, or when next I can come and be with your community, which I have done in the past more than once.
Yes,
and thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Rachel, for wonderful learning. I see from the windows behind you that the holiday has begun, so we wish you Hag Sameach, Hag Atzmaut Sameach.
All up.
Yafeh ma'od. And to everyone, this has been a marvelous experience, and what better way to finish our study of Israeli culture and life and joy, but by finishing it with the celebration of Yom HaAtzmaut, which begins tonight. So to everyone, Chag Atzmaut Sameach. Make it a very happy time. We will take Rachel up on her invitation. We're all coming for breakfast. We'll be right there. Wait for us, okay?
Okay.
Good night, everyone. Take good care, and Boker Tov, Rachel.
Yalla, להתראות. לילה טוב for you at your end. Bye-bye.
All tov. Good night, everyone. Take good care. Thank you for sharing this experience with us. It's been a wonderful journey.